brought down from Canada by the glaciers and just dropped off as the glaciers proceeded south. But the reason this got here from Scotland was because that many millions and millions of years ago, the land mass of the world was solid right across the top of the globe. And North America was all connected with Greenland and on right over to Scotland. And the plates of the earth constantly, but very slowly moved, gradually simply brought material from Scotland over to Dutchess County. So that just blew my mind right straight out of my head. I think that's amazing. So well, I'll leave these out here so you can just feel up. Oh no, these came to me by way of Mr. Alvin Knapp, who is a friend of mine, who's the historian of Mount Kisco, New York. And he was a friend of the man who did the reading. And so I was lucky enough to get a couple of them. But I think that is to me the real geology of the Hudson River. So, if you know how to put out some of the light without putting out all of them, is it possible to put out almost all of them?
Put one on in the book.
I don't want to doom you. Oh, that's lovely. Don't want to doom you to outer darkness. So, this is the very beginning of everything along the Hudson River. As you know, this was the half moon of Henry Hudson, and he sailed up the river in 1609, thinking at first that he had at last, after 3 attempts, found that passage to China, to the Orient, that he'd been looking for. It looked very possible, as wide saltwater opening. So in his little bark that was only 58 feet long, and of course just a sailing ship, sailed across the Atlantic, he and his crew started up this waterway. And they sailed on and on. It was the end of September, and no doubt both sides of the river were a picture of gorgeous autumnal glory, which they had never seen the likes of before. And all along the river's edge, here and there, they found little groups of Indians. Well, the Indians were so delighted to see this amazing ship. I'm sure it looked to them much like a spaceship would look to us today. And they came out in their dugout canoes and brought all kinds of gifts. They thought it was a visitation from the gods. So they brought out fruit and pumpkins and leather goods and all sorts of goodies for the men aboard the ship. So on it sailed up until it got just about up where Castleton and the Hudson is, and that's where I was born and brought up. So I've spent most of my life right on the Hudson River. And there they found the river was getting so narrow and so shallow that they just couldn't go any farther. But at that point, and Castleton is named for Castle Island, which was later called that by the English. They turned around to sail home after spending 3 weeks on the river. But before they left, Henry Hudson was invited on shore by the Indians for a feast. And in the ship's log, which is still intact today, written by one of the crewmen, Robert Jewett, he noted that the captain reported a very fine feast, that they had dined on a fine fat dog. So that was his feast that night. So this was, of course, in 1609, and he went back to the Dutch East India Company in Holland and reported that he had not found the Northwest Passage, but that he had found this remarkable river, beautiful, beautiful river. And it was full of fish, and there were a great many beavers and other wild animals that would be fine, and there were tall, tall trees with straight trunks that would make fine masts for ships. So it hadn't been all in vain. Well, the Dutch were very fine explorers, but very poor colonizers. And it was many years, really, before they seriously started to colonize the Hudson River banks. And finally, it was not until 1687 that one Dutchman and one Englishman bought, not stole, bought from the Indians 2 tracts of land where Poughkeepsie is today. The land that ran from Market Street down, where Market Street is now, down to the river. Poughkeepsie didn't start down along the river's edge as so many river towns do. It started up on the plateau where Market Street is. And one reason for that, I'm going the wrong way. One reason for it starting up there was that up on the plateau was a little Indian footpath wending its way in through the trees, and along that footpath was a little spring where the Indians would stop and rest and have a cool drink. And by it they built a little reed hut, and they called it Poughkeepsie, which meant a little reed hut by a water place. And that little spring is still bubbling up today after all these years. If you happen to know, well, you do know where the cemetery is, I'm sure, but if you know where Dr. Oppenheimer's animal hospital is, why the spring of Poughkeepsie is just up the hill a little bit back of that little building. And that was the beginning of the name Poughkeepsie. And if you say Poughkeepsie fast 3 times, it'll come out Poughkeepsie. But it has been spelled at least 42 different ways in the intervening years, because each group of people that came spelled it phonetically the way it sounded to them. So the Dutch called it Poughkeepsie, and some of the other people shortened it by calling P-I-K-I-P-S-I, Poughkeepsie. So finally it evolved into the word Poughkeepsie as we know it today. And that Indian footpath continued all the way up north, and Market Street in Poughkeepsie is still built right on that original Indian footpath. Much of the rest of it is occupied by Route 9, which has been changed and, of course, widened and straightened and detoured and everything. Very few parts of it are still intact on the Indian footpath, but the part that goes right through Market Street still is.
Is this sign still?
That sign was so badly vandalized and broken that at the time they put in the north-south arterial highway, it was discarded. But we do have this picture of it. And one night when I was speaking to a group of people in Poughkeepsie, a man came up to me at the close of the talk and he said, I think we ought to have that sign reproduced and put on a public building in the center of Poughkeepsie. And he said, I'll be glad to go up to $500 to do it. Well, now that's the kind of offer I like. So I immediately had a bronze plaque, a beautiful one made. And when you go to the City Hall, when you enter, take a look at the left of the door and you'll see a reproduction of this in bronze attached to the wall of the new City Hall. I did have one line added to it, which says, first settled in 1687, because I wanted that to be there for keeps, indestructible. And so in just 8 more years, I'll invite you to come to Poughkeepsie when we have our glorious 300th birthday, which will happen in 1987. Here is a picture of the complete house, the first substantial house that was built in the city. It was built up on what is now Mill Street, quite near the top of the hill. And today, this is the house that occupies that same place. And that also has one of those stake markers on it, which tells that this is the site of the Van Cleet House, the first house built in Poughkeepsie. The oldest house that we still have is the Freer farmhouse out on Wilbur Boulevard opposite Spratt Park. This was built about 1740, and it has been lived in by many different families since then. Currently, it has been bought by a lovely young couple who are very intent upon restoring it, and they have done a beautiful job inside as well as outside. If any of you went on the spring pilgrimage a year ago and now, when the Dutchess County Historical Society had its Poughkeepsie pilgrimage, did any of you go on that? I think one lady tonight said she did. Isn't there someone here who did? Yeah. Well, we stopped at this house, and Mrs. Kara entertained us in the house, all of us. Another old house that we have is Glebe House, and this is the way it looked about 1918 when it was scheduled for demolition. You see the muddy main street out in front of it. Well, this house was built before the Revolution in 1767, and it was built for the rector of the Church of England, who served both Poughkeepsie and Fishkill churches. But they gave him his choice of where his rectory would be built, and he chose Poughkeepsie. So that was his little rectory. And they lost that during the Revolution because, of course, the people who belonged to the Church of England were Tories, and most of them were driven out of Poughkeepsie, and their lands were confiscated. So John Beardsley, who was the rector of the Church of England, had to leave Poughkeepsie with his family. And this little building was occupied by the Continental officers of George Washington's army and Clinton's army. But this is the way it looks today, all restored. And you'll see this on the quilt, done very beautifully in applique work with a little picket fence around it. This is now under the custodianship of the Junior League and the Dutchess County Historical Society, and it is open, I think, every weekday in the afternoon. I know it's open in the afternoon. And it is beautifully furnished inside. You'd enjoy stopping there sometime and taking a look. And the garden club has done the garden in the back. And during the bicentennial, we packed 2 great big milk cans that Delaval Separator gave us, full of things that have to do with our lifestyle these days, even including Sears Roebuck catalog and some little toy cars and some hair rollers and all sorts of things. You wouldn't believe how much we got into those 2 big milk cans, and they are buried in the well back of Glebe House with a big plaque on top that says what is in that they're buried there, to be opened in 2076. So if any of your grandchildren are around then, tell them about it so you can be sure they go and see what's in those milk cans. On the corner of Cannon and Academy Street is the little building that was the rectory of Christ Episcopal Church when it reorganized after the Revolution. And of course they had lost their rectory, Glebe House. And the Trinity Episcopal Church in New York sent them up 500 English pounds to buy a new rectory, and they bought this little house. And the man who owns it now, who operates that food market, was so delighted when he heard this that he asked me to get him a plaque to put on the side of the building. So you'll see there's a bronze plaque on that white part there on the Cannon Street side, which says that in 1797, this house was the parsonage house for Christ Episcopal Church. For a long while, the lower part of the building was an open blacksmith shop. And then when horses went out of style, it became a food market, and that's what it is today. But the Dutch roof line, the gambrel roof, all of it, is still the original. The other old house we have is also on Main Street, a little bit below, to the west of Glebe House. And that is the Clinton House, which was pictured this way before they had cameras, when the artist could take liberties and do anything he wanted. And he made it look like a huge house up on a terrace. And then in the 1880s, when the French mansard roofs were all the rage, they remodeled this house and made it into a modern house as of 1885. This is from a postcard picture of it. And now this is the way it looks, having had another restoration. But unfortunately, they didn't put on the gambrel roof, which I would love to have had them do. As you see, that Dutch roof would have looked awfully nice on the present house. But the stonework is the original stonework, and the DAR takes good care of it. Here's the way Poughkeepsie looked in a painting. I call everything before 1850, when cameras were invented, BC, and everything after that AC, or before cameras and after cameras. So this is a BC picture, before cameras. And you see Main Street coming down the hill there. Main Street wasn't even put in down the hill until 1800, because, as I say, Poughkeepsie began right up on top of the hill, right at the corner of Market and Main Street. The Dutch gentleman who bought the property originally gave the tract of land for a courthouse and a jail on one corner of the two dusty little roads that met there. And on the opposite side, he gave a tract for the first Dutch church, the first church in Poughkeepsie. And then across from that was the first tavern looking down Market Street. Well, up on the hill, which is College Hill, you see what looks like a little house in the painting. And later you'll see a later picture of that close up. This is the very first photograph I know of the stores on Main Street. And this is the block between what is now New Market Street and Garden Street on the north side. The houses were built close together because, of course, they were all heated by big open fires, and building them close together kept them warmer. The only building that is still there that's in this picture is that tallest one, which is now the Duchess Bank and Trust Company building. Here's a later picture looking up what they used to call the Filkentown Road. At first they called it East Lane, and it went out as far as what is now Academy Street. Academy Street was at the eastern edge of Poughkeepsie, the farthest street out, and it was called Ragged Lane. But when they built a boys' school on it in 1792, a boys' academy, they changed the name to Academy Street. So that's, and you see Market Street coming in from the right. In 1799, after the Revolution, the little tiny hamlet had grown to be big enough, 1,500 people, to be an incorporated village. So then it became a village, and in 1854 it had grown to 12,000 and was big enough to be a city. So they adopted the Dutch colors, orange, white, and blue, for their flag, and they also took the beehive for their symbol, because by then Poughkeepsie had many little mills and factories scattered all through it on the Poughkeepsie Creek for water power, all the way down to the river. In fact, Clinton Square used to be a big pond of water called the Red Mill Pond, because it had little mills all around it. And now, of course, the Poughkeepsie Creek is channeled underneath it, and we blithely drive over it, but it's still under there. So they were so industrious, had so many industries, that they took the busy bee for their symbol. Here's one of our treasures that we still, fortunately, have preserved. It's on the corner of Mill Street and Gossip Street, and it is a church that was built by a splinter group from the Presbyterian Church in 1835, at a time when Thomas Jefferson's love for the Greek architecture had sort of permeated the country, and any fashionable house or elegant public building was built in the Greek style. So that's the way this is, and it's been occupied through the years, first by the Presbyterians, then by a group of Congregationalists who came over from Connecticut. Later, Mr. Eastman rented it from Matthew Vassar II as one of his school buildings for Eastman College. And then it became the first Jewish synagogue in Poughkeepsie, and now it is the Second Baptist Church, a black church. And they are very proud of it and take lovely care of it. Down on North Clover Street is still one of those residences, one of those 1,830 residences, now occupied by an Italian gentleman named Mr. Dalio, who has a grocery store in that neighborhood. Now this is that little house you saw in the painting up on top of College Hill. It was a boys' school erected by a group of businessmen in Poughkeepsie in 1835 for a private school for boarding boys. They boarded 200 boys up there on top of College Hill. And there was even a big ballroom in that building. It was enormous. And it was built to look like the Parthenon in Athens. Poughkeepsie at that time had over 50, from that time through the middle 1800s, had over 50 private schools for boys and girls.
That wasn't the military.
No, not yet.
No.
This was before the military academy. So this one you saw in College Hill was the biggest boys' academy. This was the biggest girls' school. This was Poughkeepsie Female Seminary at 12 Cannon Street. And now that piece of land is a parking lot. But those were the two elegant schools. But there were many other little schools like this one, Miss Tappan's School for Young Ladies on Garden Street. And I have a feeling Miss Tappan didn't put up with any nonsense. She probably turned out some young ladies, all right, from that little school. But there were so many schools, and they were good ones, many very good ones, that it attracted lots of young people from outside of Poughkeepsie to come to school there. One of the earliest churches that we still have is the Church of the Holy Comforter down near the arterial highway. It's an Episcopal church, and it is beautiful inside. If you go in, you will truly think you're in one of the European churches. It has that atmosphere about it. And one interesting thing is that it was built in 1860, before the Civil War, by a man named William Davies, in memory of his wife and his father. And he built it, furnished money for the whole thing. And how much do you think it cost? Man, $16,000 to build that church. Then we come to one of my great heroes, Mr. Eastman, Mr. Harvey Eastman. As you certainly have heard, he had a very successful business college in Poughkeepsie for many years. He flew into Poughkeepsie at the age of 27 in 1859, and he started his National Eastman Business College with one student in one rented room on Market Street, for which he paid 75 cents a week. And in 3 years' time, he had 1,700 students in his college. Before he ever got to Poughkeepsie, he had circularized the whole United States, and as they said, the islands of the sea, with brochures and advertising material about this wonderful college in Poughkeepsie. He had never set foot in Poughkeepsie when he did all this. He was a cousin of George Eastman of Kodak fame out in Rochester. And he had worked for his uncle, George's father, for a little while in what he called a business school in Rochester. But actually, they only taught arithmetic and penmanship. So this young Harvey, when he was long about 24, started school in St. Louis, Missouri. And there he ran into a peck of trouble because he was a strong advocate of anti-slavery. And wow, in St. Louis, Missouri, Missouri, you were bound to knock heads with people if you were in favor of no slavery. So he had to pull up stakes and move, and it was at that time that he heard all about Poughkeepsie, a city of schools, and it was located on the beautiful Hudson River. That was enough for him. And he got out the most terrific advertising material. Really, I look at that man's head and think what went on in that brain of his, because he was 50 years at least ahead of his time on this advertising business. People hadn't tumbled to advertising yet. And he had so much mail coming into Poughkeepsie before he ever got here that the postmaster complained bitterly, "Who is this Eastman? Why doesn't he come and pick up his mail? There are baskets full here, all over the floor. No room for the regular mail." He sputtered on. Well, finally, Mr. Eastman came, collected his mail, and as I say, he started right off getting results from his advertising. And you can imagine the impact on a little city of barely 12,000 people, having a couple of thousand young men come in from all over the United States and the islands of the sea to live in everybody's guest rooms and bed down in the courthouse and in the church basements. Mr. Eastman never built a dormitory. He didn't furnish any places for the men to sleep. He would pay for them, but he didn't furnish a ready-made place. And when these boys would come to Poughkeepsie, they were so indoctrinated by his advertising that they thought they were coming to a place that had a beautiful campus. Instead of that, they found they had to find their own place to sleep and eat, and they had to have one class down in the Presbyterian church and another one up in some other church uptown or in the Comedy Building. It was all dispersed all over the city. So that was Mr. Eastman for you. Here was his mansion that he built down in Eastman Park. He bought 27 acres of disreputable, swampy land just south of the village, and he turned it into a beautiful park. He channeled all of the water from the swamp into one central pond, built an island in the middle, and later than this picture, he built a gazebo on that island and had band concerts there. I haven't heard how the band got out there, whether they had to walk in the water or what. I have to find that out sometime. But then in the winter, it was all arranged so that with pipes, the water from the lake went down onto the lower level and became a skating rink where our ball field is today. He also decided to bring a little bit of Greenwich Village to Poughkeepsie. So he started to build 23 of these row houses on Eastman Terrace, overlooking his park. But when he built 10, he found to his sorrow that Poughkeepsians really didn't take to walking up and downstairs all the day long. There were four floors, each with 2 rooms on a floor, so that you always had to be going up and down, up and down. And now, having been in a slump for years and almost going to pieces, those buildings are being bought by young people and are being all restored. It's wonderful, the young people that are moving into Poughkeepsie and preserving and restoring things. Another one of Mr. Eastman's brainstorms was our lovely fountain. He thought that after the Civil War, Poughkeepsie should do something very spectacular in memory of their soldiers that had died in the war. So he started circulating subscriptions, which was what they did in those days. They circulated these pieces of paper, and you signed on them how much you would give for any project. Well, people were so slow signing up for that fountain that he just went ahead and did the whole thing himself. And the interesting thing is that at the time that they built that fountain, there wasn't a bit of water anywhere around. There were no pipes of water to turn on the water. And I really think that is something. The nearest water was some up at the corner of Market and Main Street, which came down from a reservoir on Cannon Street Hill for firefighting purposes. And they dug a 6-foot trench by hand, of course, all the way from Market Main Street down to this fountain to get water down to it. And it was dedicated on 4th of July, 1870. And now, as you know, we've had it all restored, and up on the table afterwards you'll see some photographs that I have of 2 other fountains in the world that are replicas of ours. One is in Savannah, Georgia, and the other one is in Cusco, Peru, and they're identical with ours. This is a postcard picture of the fountain of 1910, sort of a wild artist's version, I would think. And here's the way it looks now, and the way it looks at night. In 1861, this gentleman, of course this is a simulated film made from a monument of Lincoln, he stopped off in Poughkeepsie over a train on his way from Springfield, Illinois to Washington to be inaugurated. This was in February of 1861. And he made a very lovely speech to the people in Poughkeepsie. He said that he was sure that among his listeners there were people who felt that a mistake had been made in the election. And he said, I am inclined to agree with them, which I thought was a very unusual statement, come from a president-elect. But he said that the guns of war were slowly gathering, and he was afraid the ship of state was in for a bad time. This is an engraving of the way the corner of Market and Main Street looked during the Civil War. The old courthouse, which preceded the one that's there now, is there on the corner. And below it is the Dutch church, which by then had been built on a different location. You see this building at the left, the 3-story one. The Dutch people had leased that to a man named Mr. Benedict, no, Mr. Brewster, for 100 years. So from 1830 to 1930, they had no control of that block, and that business block was there. But when the church regained possession of it in 1930, then they took down the Brewster block and built the 2-story church building, as it was called, on the corner of Market and Main Street. And when you go around that corner, if you look in the sidewalk, you'll see an insert of brass, an angle of brass set into the concrete. And that shows you where the property line of the Dutch church came to, out into the sidewalk. Sort of interesting. And then over at the right, you see the verandas of the Poughkeepsie Hotel, which, as you know by now, was blocked the way through Poughkeepsie. You came up the old Indian footpath trail to that point, and then the Indians went off down the hill to get a place to ford the Fallkill Creek, and that's why the Indian footpath didn't go right through, because the terrain was such that they decided it was better to go off downhill and cross the creek farther down. The Liberty Pole was the fashion. During the Revolution there was a Liberty Pole, and this is the Civil War. And by then, Poughkeepsians were very proud of themselves and wanted always to have the biggest, the first, the finest, and so on. So they had to have the tallest Liberty Pole in the Hudson Valley. So they got a 100-foot mast off from a sloop and spliced a 60-foot mast on it. And so they had the tallest one in the Hudson Valley. Then in April of 1865, Lincoln came back to Poughkeepsie. It was on April the 25th, 1865, and this film again is a film that has been made to look as nearly as possible like his funeral train. It rolled into Poughkeepsie at 10:30 at night on its muffled wheels and felt on the wheels, so that the train wouldn't make any noise as it rolled into the station. And there were over 10,000 people that night who went down to pay their respects to Lincoln. My projectors had to go back for repairs. This is one I borrowed from ARAC's the occasion. Sometimes it misbehaves a little. So up on the corner of Vassar Street and Main Street, where Mr. Vassar Sr., the founder of Vassar College, used to live, after his death, they took his two nephews, who we call our Vassar brothers, Matthew II and John Guy Vassar, took down his home and built this big home in his memory to be an old men's home. But that night that Lincoln's train came through, Mr. Vassar, who was not well enough to go down with the train himself, broke a branch off from a magnolia bush on his front lawn. And this may possibly be the very same bush. I don't know. I've been told by a horticulturist that it's possible it is. But anyway, he broke off this branch of magnolia and gave it to his housekeeper and asked her, if possible, to have it laid on Lincoln's casket. And she was able to do that. And it said on the front page of the Poughkeepsie Journal a week later that the branch of magnolia traveled all the way to Springfield, Illinois, and was placed on Lincoln's grave. So that is not a legend, it is a true story. So now, of course, this building has been taken over by the Poughkeepsie Area Fund and beautifully restored, and is the place where most of the non-profit groups have their offices. The Philharmonic, Dutchess County Philharmonic, and Dutchess County Interfaith Council, Landmarks, the ballet, many different non-profit groups have their offices in that building. And that is open to the public. And please go in there sometime and enjoy the lovely furnishings that they now have in the parlors. Here's a picture of Mr. Matthew Vassar. And young people, just snort when I show this picture. They think this is a riot. But I'll tell you that this man was worth knowing about. He, along with Mr. Eastman, I had a great deal of respect for many reasons. But superficially, a man of his period who was a successful businessman wore a high beaver hat. That was routine, and he had a velvet collar on his coat, and he carried a cane, usually a gold-headed cane. And he put ESQ after his name. So that was his lifestyle. Well, Mr. Vassar had been brought to Poughkeepsie when he was 4 years old from England by his father, along with all the family. His father had been a brewer in England, and he became a brewer in Poughkeepsie. And he lived, down on Vassar Street. His brewery was on Vassar Street. And this little boy had hardly been out of Poughkeepsie all his life. Once or twice to New York, once out to Utica, but very little else. And we have access to his good diary, which is very, very nice. So we know a lot about him. But anyway, when he had made quite a bit of money, about 1845, he and his wife set off for a 3-year trip to Europe to do the grand tour of Europe. Actually, they were only gone for 7 months because the only quotation I have ever found about Mrs. Vassar was that after 7 months of travel, she said she became very weary and wished to return to the comforts of her home. So they came back. But in those 7 months, Mr. Vassar had seen colleges, universities, palaces, libraries, hospitals, orphanages, museums, everything that Europe had to offer. And it evidently made a tremendous impression upon him. So that when he came home, he was determined, as he said, to do something magnificent for his home city. And after a good deal of pondering and considering, he decided it should be a college for young women. He didn't have any children of his own. But he said, and his words are embroidered right on that quilt because I wanted them preserved for posterity. He said to his hand-picked board of trustees the day he took up the first shovel puller for main building at his college, he said, quote, "It has occurred to me that woman has been endowed by her Creator with the same intellectual constitution as men, and therefore should be afforded the same opportunity for intellectual and cultural development," unquote. Now, don't you think that's quite a statement? So that was his theory in establishing a girls' college, which he said would be the equivalent of Yale and Harvard. Well, it opened in September of 1865. Oh, by the way, this was his big brewery down by the river. The first one his father had was a little wooden brewery up on Bassett Street, but it burned down twice. And then in 1836, Matthew built this one down by the river. But in 1865, when the college opened, this is the way main building looked. It had been built on a racetrack, nice, level, flat piece of land. Mr. Vassar had gradually accumulated 200 acres of land, farmland, cleared for his college, and there was not a tree or a bush on it. So that's why it looks the way it does. Poughkeepsians were very fond of racing, horses, and so there were 4 different racetracks, and this was built on one of them. And as I told you, he was very much impressed by what he had seen in Europe. And he said to his fine architect he hired to do this job, whose name was James Renwick, who later designed the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. He said to Mr. Renwick, "I wanted to look like the Palace of Versailles. So I found that I had taken a picture on a dark day of the Palace of Versailles, and you can see how very similar it does look to the Palace of Versailles." Another thing he said to his architect was, and this is the one time he was really dead wrong, he said, "Any girl who is interested in higher education will not be interested in clothes. So there's no need of putting clothes closets in the girls' room." But he was really wrong about that, and later on they had to go through and put closets in the girls' room. Well, this is the way main building looks today with its marvelous trees grown up around it, and one of the newer members of the school body lying on the lawn out in front. Did you know that now they are almost 50-50? The boys almost equal in number to the girls at that. They were aiming at a 50-50. Here's a picture of the old city, or the old courthouse that I showed you in the engraving, down on the corner of Markham and Main. The one we have now is the 5th one that has been built on that very same corner. This is it. And in order to maintain their deed, which Mr. Hermans Vanderbilt gave them along with the land, for a courthouse and a jail, they have to maintain one jail cell in the cellar, in the basement. So they let you go down and take a picture of it. It's full of junk. It's a jail cell, all right. So nobody can come back and say, you haven't any jail, so the deed needs to be forfeited. And on the outside of the building, I don't know if you've ever stopped to read this, but when this new courthouse was built in 1904, the VAR ladies gave this beautiful plaque, and on it says that on July 26th of 1788, on this site, the Constitution of the United States was ratified, and that makes that corner a very historic spot for many reasons, not just that it was signed there, but the meaning of it and the significance of that signing, because Governor Clinton was not in favor of ratifying it, and he brought a lot of delegates to that convention with the idea that they would vote it down. And if New York had not ratified and had become a separate country, we would have ended up like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia for all the world. 3 little separate countries along the eastern seaboard of the country, ready to be gobbled up by foreign nations. In fact, they said that Clinton almost did what George III had not been able to do, and that was separate the colonies. Because the entire strategy of the Revolution had been to gain control of the Hudson River, to separate the colonies, and then the war would be over. And everyone knew that without New York State, which extended from the Canadian border right down to New York Harbor, there would be no hope of a United States of America without New York State. So for 6 weeks, those 65 delegates battled it out, discussing and arguing the matter, and Alexander Hamilton came, and he would orate for 3 hours at a time, urging them to ratify. Finally, on this famous day of July 26, 1788, the vote was taken, and the vote was 30 in favor and 27 against. It was that close. And those of us who live in Dutchess County should never forget that 3 determining votes were made by 3 of the Dutchess County delegates. So that was a near thing. And I think for that reason that every child in Dutchess County ought to know what happened on that corner in 1788. On the corner just below the courthouse was the old Dutch church. You saw a picture of it in the engraving with a spire, if you were very apt to noticing that spire. But after 20 years, that spire got wobbly and they had to take it off. So this picture, later one, it's a metal. So the banks in Poughkeepsie, like they did everywhere, just made their own money. This was a 50-cent shin plaster. And on the library lawn is mounted a gun from the Monitor. I'm sure you all learned in school that the Monitor was the first ironclad ship, and that it fought a great battle of the Merrimack in Chesapeake Bay and won. Well, the Monitor was designed by a man named Erickson, but the money for it was furnished by Mr. Winslow, who had a beautiful estate just north of the Poughkeepsie line, across from where Western Printing is today. And so after his death, his daughter gave the city of Poughkeepsie one of the guns off from the Monitor in memory of her father. It's mounted there on the agent's lawn. Here's a picture of the Market Street setup. The bank building on the corner is still there, minus its Grecian columns, but otherwise intact. And you see the muddy street, and it ends there at the Poughkeepsie Hotel. Bardavon Theater is in that picture. And here's Lucky Platts in its early days. It started in with just a little store 16 feet wide, but very deep. And gradually they added on to the building. Then it was 2 stories, and then it was 4 stories. And then they began acquiring all the property from there up to the corner of Academy Street, until it finally became a big Lucky Platts store. And down on the corner of Union and Market Street, where the county building is today, was Lawyers Row. Poughkeepsie was famous for its lawyers and its judges, and they all had their offices in Lawyers Row. During the Civil War, the trend toward industry was to get down to the river and use river water for steam power. So the little mill of Adrian's that had been up on the Red Mill Pond moved down to the river and built this tremendous big plant, the Adrian's Platt, Reaper and Plow Company. And just as a little sidelight, the building was complete at the end of the Civil War, but the machinery hadn't been moved into the main part of it. And our Mr. Eastman, with his flair for publicity, gave a dinner for 2,500 men in that huge factory building, and Smith Brothers catered it. And he did it to attract the returning soldiers to his business college. He said it was well worth the money because many of them decided to enter the college. And in 1870, they began to have horse cars. Sometimes it took 4 horses to pull the horse car up Main Street Hill in the wintertime. Then in 1872, thanks to Mr. Eastman, the Poughkeepsie had the first water purification plant in the whole United States. Mr. Eastman was then mayor of Poughkeepsie, and he sent an engineer to London to find out how to build a water purification plant. And as a result, Poughkeepsie had the very first one, because they had had all of these buildings that I showed you tight together, built so closely, and every one had its own well or cistern in the backyard and its own outhouse right beside it. So you can imagine the pollution of the drinking water. And now we have another problem, but it isn't the same one. This is caused by chemical pollution that comes down to us from the north. So we still have to fight about it, but at least we had the first one. And the next year, they actually had 4 men who delivered your mail to your door. Before that, everybody had to go down to the post office every day on Garden Street and pick up his mail. And in 1878, what was laughingly called woman's best friend came to Poughkeepsie in the form of a telephone. I don't think it's our best friend anymore sometimes. This is an old picture of a building which you'll recognize perhaps as this. This is the Franklin apartment building on the corner of Franklin Street and South Hamilton. But it was built originally in 1858 by a group of concerned Poughkeepsie women who took 10 years to get together the $10,000 needed to build that building. And it was called the Home for the Friendless, because it was not only an orphanage, it was also an old ladies' home. So they compromised by calling it Home for the Friendless, terrible name. And finally, after a few years, they moved the ladies out because it didn't work as well as they'd hoped. I'm sure they hoped the ladies would help take care of the children, but it didn't seem to work. So they moved the ladies out, and then it was still called the Home for the Friendless until 1919. So somebody thought of the bright idea of changing it to the Children's Home. And then in 1923, they moved up to the new building in Fairview. But this is the way it looks now, made into an apartment house. But that has held many, many hundreds of little children in its time. There's the old Boys Academy, and I told you it began down on the corner of Ragged Lane and Cannon Street in 1792. Well, in 1836, they built this new building up on what we call Trinity Square. And now it's the front part of the old ladies' home, now called Vassar Warner Home. I was there this afternoon for their annual card party. So this was really the Boys Academy building. And there's still a window on the first floor where some little imp has used his pocket knife to mark his initials on the window glass. So he left his immortal print on that building. And now this is the way it looks, with the big addition on the back, built in 1905 by Mr. W.W. Smith of cough drop fame. Here's Cannon Street, which was the first street to be laid out as a street. Straight, a regular straight street. Up until then, all the streets had been simply built on footpaths. There was Market Street, the old Indian footpath. Then there were 3 curving, winding footpaths down to the river, where men carried things on their backs to put onto the sloops that carried merchandise up and down the river. They were Upper Landing Road, which is now Mill Street, Union Street, and Pine Street. Those were all just footpaths that went down to the water's edge. And down south of the main part of Poughkeepsie, what used to be called Freer Town, was the Livingston Manor House. And this was supposed to be a very beautiful, beautiful home in its time. And when the British fleet came up the river in October of 1777 and burned down Kingston, on their way back, they hurled several cannonballs at Poughkeepsie, and one of them came to rest right by the front door of the Livingston Manor House. And they left that hole right there and built a little glass box around it. The cannonball is now down at Washington's headquarters in Newburgh. Here's the way our main mall looked 109 years ago. So if anyone thinks we haven't prove, I will argue with it a little bit. Lucky Platt's was just 1 year old at that time. If you have real good eyesight, you can perhaps see a Lucky Platt banner on the street. And at the time of the Civil War, a good many beautiful new houses were built on South Hamilton Street. This is the Brinkerhoff house. And here's the way it looked originally. He had it done over quite a bit. And he wanted the architect to make it look like a ferry boat, because he owned the steam ferries. And it really does. The Poughkeepsians had lots of fun on the river, boating and ice boating, all kinds of sports on the river. And this beautiful ship they called Poetry in Motion, a lovely name. And it once made 86 miles an hour on a measured mile. So that was pretty fast when it was last 100 years ago or today, 86 miles an hour. And this was what makes people just sigh with sorrow. Oyster stew, 25 cents. Poughkeepsie was... Poughkeepsie was the hospitality. Everybody came to Poughkeepsie to do their shopping and their legal business, everything. From across the river and all around, so we had any quantity of hotels and boarding houses and restaurants. And here's the first hospital we had. This is just the way it looks today. The grade of the road has been raised considerably. This is 108 North Clinton Street. And that was St. Barnabas Hospital, a 10-bed hospital organized and run by the 3 Episcopal churches of Poughkeepsie from 1871 until the new Vassar Brothers Hospital was opened in 1887. But the building is still there. Here's the way the original Vassar Brothers Hospital looked. It was considered the finest and most progressive hospital, and it attracted so many fine young doctors. Scott Lord Smith and Dr. Harrington, lots of our finest doctors came because they wanted to work at the Vassar Hospital. This is the first ambulance. The first ambulance that Vassar Brothers Hospital had. And it too is still in existence down at Smith's Clove, Monroe, New York. We've lost a lot of our treasures. And this was March 12, 1888, the Great Blizzard of 1888, with no mechanical equipment to remove the snow, only shovelful by shovelful. So this is the way they got into the stowers. They just burrowed into the stowers. And the next year, the Great Bridge was opened. The first bridge on the Hudson River carried trains across, and it connected the New England states with the coal fields of Pennsylvania, and was really a remarkable achievement. It took 17 years to get built, and there again, that was Harvey Eastman's brainchild. It was he who turned over the first spadeful of earth for that bridge. But unfortunately, the poor man died at the age of 45 of tuberculosis, long before he had a chance to do all he meant to do. So he did not live to see the bridge completed, because so many people died. And you think we've been dug up lately? Well, this picture was taken in 1895, standing on the corner of South Hamilton Street looking east. And that was the year that they put in the new tracks for the electric trolleys, all the way from the river up to Vassar College. And this, of course, all had to be done with picks and shovels and wheelbarrows and horse-drawn carts. So it was a tremendous job. But finally it all got done and in place, and the trolleys were clanging, and the milk carts were delivering the milk, and look at the maze of overhead wires on Main Street. Then the bicycle rage in Poughkeepsie, 1895, and the professional men, doctors, lawyers, all kinds of businessmen, owned their own penny farthing bicycles, they're called. Penny for the big front wheel and farthing for the little back. And Mr. Van Benskow, later years, had his penny farthing bicycle mounted on the roof of the Dodge Automobile Agency that he owned out of Switzerland. And he rode one time in a relay race all the way from, part of the way from Poughkeepsie to Montreal, when they had these long bicycle races. Here was one of the clubs later on. The thing to do on a Sunday afternoon was to ride the open trolley out to the fairgrounds, corner of Grand Avenue and Hooker, and
cheer for your favorite bicycle club. Here was the entrance there at the corner to the fairgrounds. And here was the racetrack, and now that is all developed into proper streets and lots of trees, houses. One night I was speaking to a small group of home bureau people in a house out there, and the hostess whispered to me, you know, our house is built right in the middle of that racetrack. This was the first automobile to be built in Poughkeepsie in 1902. It was a Lane steamer. And then by 1905, there were lots of Lane steamers. Maybe we'll get back to using water power again, who knows? But you know, the funny thing about steamers was that you had to actually build a fire under them to get the steam up in your motor. The idea of ladies riding bicycles was definitely not approved at all. It was frowned upon. And the little piece that went with this picture said, the young ladies who do this are considered rather fast. Now, that isn't the worst thing you can say about any woman. Oh, way back, they had them. This was in the very early days. I have no doubt that was a Vassar girl. And Mrs. O'Neill was talking about the old post office on the way out tonight. That is it. That's on the very corner where the county building is now, with the Nelson House behind it. Here's the Eastman College building on Washington Street, built long after Mr. Eastman had died. As I told you, he didn't have time to do any building of college buildings while he was alive. As a matter of fact, they used to say that over the doorway of that building should have said, Eastman's gift to Poughkeepsie's young women. Because, as I told you, the boys lived all over, and mostly in people's guest rooms. So they got very well acquainted with the young ladies in Poughkeepsie. And many of them did marry those girls. Aha! And stayed on, some of them stayed on in Poughkeepsie and became leading businessmen. Now you asked about the Military Institute. In 1867, the big school on College Hill was given up, and the boys marched 2 by 2 down College Hill, through Poughkeepsie, and down to their new school building in Riverview Park, which you call now Riverview Park. So that was the Poughkeepsie Military Institute. And many a fine Poughkeepsie citizen has graduated from that, as well as from all over. And this was the high school building on Washington Street. Strangely, not really so strangely, because as you know now, there were so many private schools in Poughkeepsie. It was a long, long time before Poughkeepsie gave in to public education. People took the attitude, well, we pay for our children's education. Why should we pay for other people's children's education? So it wasn't until 1871 that Poughkeepsie had this high school building. And that was 6 years after Vassar College was a going concern. Seems strange, really, but you can understand it when there were so many schools in Poughkeepsie. Now, do you remember that first picture I showed you of the little wooden houses and stores along Main Street? This is 75 years later, the very same section of Main Street, showing how different the buildings are. In 1909, they reconstructed the Half Moon, which you saw the picture of at the beginning, and the Claremont, and they had, do any of you remember, the Hudson-Fulton celebration, all up and down the river. Well, these 2 pictures that I had were made from pictures I got from the National Geographic of 1909. So that shows you the 1909 skyline of New York in the background. And the Claremont had been the source of a great deal of scorn on the part of people when Robert Fulton first brought it to the Hudson River. It only made 5 miles an hour for sure. And some of the people said it looked like a backwoods sawmill mounted on a raft, because always people make fun of anything new, as you know. But anyway, 5 miles an hour was good, because it kept right on going, whereas the sailboats were at the mercy of the winds and the tides and the eddies in the river, and they couldn't always make it anywhere near that good time. Poughkeepsie decorated for the occasion. This was called the Court of Honor on Market Street, on the corner of Main looking south. And this is the way it looked at night, all lighted up. Here's one of the folks at the end of Main Street. We hope to goodness we'll soon, pretty soon, have another boat landing in Poughkeepsie. And on the corner of Catherine Street in Maine was the Morgan House, which was considered a very fine hotel. And if you don't think people were fancy and elegant, this was the Pompeian room in that when it burned to the ground in 1917. So that was the end of it. And did you go to the boat races? They were on the river from 1895 until 1948. So those are within our time, you see. And it was a great day, even as late as 1948. And if it rained, we went just the same. This is Tall Rock with people watching the boat races. And this was the kind of taxi people hired if they were going to a wedding or a funeral, or if a young man was going to take his girl out, they'd hire a carriage. And this was another form of great entertainment on the river, the Pier Mary Powell. It was built in 1860, and it continued to use the river until it finally hit a rock in 1919 and had to be salvaged. And the captain of the Mary Powell had a tremendous record for speed and punctuality. He intended to keep his schedule. And they said that he used whale oil on the bottom of the boat to make it glide more quickly through the water. And he even hired a little black boy to shoo the flies off the railing so they wouldn't keep the boat from going as fast as possible. This was one of the floating palaces. They'll never come back again because they would be fire traps now. They wouldn't be allowed. And here's dear Mr. W.W. Smith, one of the Smith brothers. He outlived his brother by 20 years. And the Smith brothers had a very different philosophy about the money they made in cough drops. Up until then, the industrialists of Poughkeepsie had been gung-ho on expanding Poughkeepsie and making it the greatest place in the country and all that. But the Smith brothers said they considered the money they made to be a sacred trust, which should be used for the benefit of their fellow men. So, as a result, Poughkeepsie got YWCA and the YMCA, the addition on the Old Ladies' Home, the almshouse infirmary, and all kinds of things just done as a gift from the Smith brothers. So you see, he was a pretty wonderful man. And that's the famous Smith brothers cough drop bar. And here's the thing people remember because it wasn't discontinued until 1953. No, those old-fashioned fans have become very popular again. So that's the end of the story for tonight, and I thank you very much for